Folks, ever since I covered Jeffrey Epstein and his very dark life and death, there's been a lot of talk about suspicious deaths, potential murders, natural, just people naturally checking out, people checking themselves out. There's been a lot of very suspicious things going around. And one of the groups of people that have been tied to a lot of suspicious checking outs is the Clintons. Now, you might remember that I did in my Jeffrey Epstein video series where I was talking about all the suspicious deaths related to Jeffrey Epstein. One of them was this guy, Mark Middleton. Now, they said that he checked himself out, okay? He had apparently left himself swinging with electrical cord tied around his neck, and then they later found a shotgun 30 feet from his body. They said he blasted himself with the shotgun and checked out with the electrical cord tied around his neck. It was a little bit suspicious, okay? He had texted his wife about finding a perfect place for a nap before this happened, and this guy was an aide to Bill Clinton with links to Jeffrey Epstein, and he was basically the person who had brought Jeffrey Epstein around the Clintons and around the White House quite extensively during Clinton's premiership. But another person who's been linked to the Clintons who died under very suspicious circumstances I'm going to talk to you about in this video is JFK Jr., okay, this is a very little known, a very lesser known situation that is very, very bizarre, very dark. So this is a USA Today article fact-checking this insane theory that the Clintons might have had something to do with what happened to JFK Jr. So I'm going to read you this article, and I'm going to give you some more backstory as far as what happened to JFK Jr. And you can make up your own minds about exactly what happened. It says the claim was that Daniel Moynihan had decided to retire, and JFK Jr. was looking to run for his seat. Hillary Clinton decided to run, and then days later, JFK Jr.'s plane went missing. Okay, we're just gonna pretend all these. All right, we're just gonna pretend this is normal. John F. Kennedy Jr., the son and namesake of the nation's 35th president, died 10 days after then First Lady Hillary Clinton made her first public moves to run for a soon-to-open U.S. Senate seat in New York. A meme circulated on social media suggests the two events were related. When Daniel Moynihan decided to retire his seat, JFK Jr. said he was interested in running on the seat. Days later, Hillary Clinton also decided to run for the open seat, and within months of the Clintons' announcement, JFK Jr.'s private plane went missing. Now, it doesn't make a direct accusation, but commenters would basically make the connection. They're saying, who are these people that go around murdering people when they feel threatened, right? Conspiracy Eye didn't respond to requests for comment, but basically, the innuendo is not original. This has been going around for a while. Fact checkers like Snopes and PolitiFact have shot others like it down. But let's take a deeper dive into the origins of that claim and some of the machinations, public and behind the scenes, that led to Clinton being elected to the Senate from New York 20 years ago and the young Kennedy to stay out the race. So it was November 1998 when veteran Democratic Senator Daniel Moynihan said he wouldn't be getting his fifth term 2 years later. And the presidency of Bill Clinton was coming to an end in 2000. The Clintons' marriage was in a mess from the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and Hillary Clinton decided it was her turn to start a political career. She had a White House meeting with advisors in February 1999, specifically looking at that seat. And around the same time, Kennedy launched his innovative magazine, George, 3 years earlier. He was starting to think about getting into politics, like his father. And according to the 2019 biography, America's Reluctant Prince, The Life of John F. Kennedy Jr., historian and Kennedy friend Stephen Gillian, basically wrote that the fledgling magazine editor Kennedy contacted well-known New York political operatives about running for the Senate. Okay, Kennedy, then 38, was on Clinton's radar. And one of the First Lady's advisors said the camp was scared about his potential candidacy. Meanwhile, one of the pros that Kennedy had approached, New York Union leader Dennis Rivera, assured him at a meeting on St. Patrick's Day 1999 that state Democratic power brokers would tell Clinton to stand back should Kennedy enter the race. Interesting what happened then, right? So Kennedy was hesitant. He said, will people take me seriously, before bailing on the race days later. He said, I don't think it's time for me, Gillen quoted him as saying. Kennedy's magazine, which sought to highlight the connection between politics and entertainment, was struggling, and his young marriage required nurturing. Clinton, meanwhile, forged ahead with her plans. On July the 6th, she filed the paperwork required by the Federal Election Commission to begin raising money. That was followed by her listening tour to see if New Yorkers would accept someone who had never lived in the state as a candidate to represent them in the Senate. But his life would be cut short. Kennedy had got his pilot license just a year before he and his wife, the former Carolyn Bessette, and her sister flew in a private aircraft from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts for a family wedding. But the plane crashed into the Atlantic and all aboard were killed on July the 16th, 1999. When your last name's Kennedy, you got to look out. You got to look out, okay? Gilliam wrote that he's nearly certain Kennedy someday planned to seek political office, perhaps even the presidency. He was promoting his book, and Kennedy thought of himself more of an executive than a possible legislator, and suggested he might have been biding his time to run for governor of New York in 2002. Ironically, Gilliam said just days before his death, Kennedy was critical of Clinton's decision to enter the Senate race. He said the New York Democrats should choose someone from New York. Gilliam writes that he reminded his friend that the seat in question had once been held by Kennedy's uncle, the late Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, who's now a big dog, okay? So aspects of the timing of the soon-to-open Senate seat and the resulting early moves by Clinton and Kennedy provide the seeds for the conspiracy theory, but even if nothing else would debunk these veiled assertions, the actual timing does just that. So Moynihan gave notice in November 98. Clinton's White House meeting with advisors to discuss possible candidacy took place in 99. Kennedy's huddle with the New York operatives took place on St. Patrick's Day in March. That's months, not days, as the meme suggests, after it was known the seat would be open. For all practical purposes, Clinton's campaign launched with the FEC paperwork on July the 6th, 1999. That was quickly followed by the listening tour. But then Kennedy's plane crashed 10 days later in July the 16th. That's days, not months, after the Clinton campaign was already up and running. However, months after he decided he wasn't actually going to run. Finally, Clinton's formal announcement of her candidacy came February the 6th, 2000. That was months after Kennedy's death, not before it, as the meme suggested. So the fact checkers are saying that it's false, all right? They basically are inferring that the meme is basically separating a series of events and concluding that one series caused the outcome of the other, but the step-by-step assertions are riddled with errors, and it undermines the already dubious implication that a sitting First Lady would play the role in a death of a son of a former president for political advantage. They rate this claim as false, okay? They rate this claim as false, but does make you wonder, okay? There was a lot going on. So let's look a little bit closer into what actually happened, okay? At the time of his death, JFK Jr. was probably one of the most popular Democrats in New York. He had motion, all right? He was popping. So this is how he was appealing to the public, and he could have been the next president if he was still alive.
And posed like the biblical Adam, John F. Kennedy Jr. brings family scandals to the readers of the September issue of his political magazine, George. Kennedy writes about two cousins, Congressman Joseph Kennedy, who was criticized by his ex-wife for forcing her to get an annulment, and Michael Kennedy, who allegedly had an affair with the 14-year-old babysitter, saying they had become poster boys for bad behavior. One left behind an embittered wife, Kennedy writes, and another, in what looked to be a hedge against mortality, fell in love with youth and surrendered his judgment in the process.
In no way does he take to task I guess either his cousins or his brothers. I think he attempts in some funny way to let them off the hook, to suggest that we are at fault for demanding moral behavior.
Kennedy's letter was an uncharacteristically public comment, drawing attention to the 2-year-old magazine he edits. His cousin suggests that was his intent.
I guess my first reaction was, ask not what you can do for your cousin, but what you can do for his magazine.
George magazine was introduced 2 years ago in what one expert called the most exciting magazine launch ever. But George's content is considered less cutting edge than expected. Like the debut issue in 1995, George is generating discussion once again, not for its editorial substance, but for its editor.
John Kennedy is carving out, a career for himself, which is, different from the typical Kennedy career of going into politics. He's a journalist.
Taking your clothes off has got nothing to do with journalism last I checked.
Officials with the magazine had little comment.
He, I think, was aware that it would cause some controversy, but John knows what he's doing.
September is a big month for magazine advertising, which may explain why Kennedy chose this time and this issue to bear his philosophy along with his physique.
Okay, I don't know what the hell that's all about, all right? We're going to take that off the screen. But basically, he was taking people to task with his magazine. He was wiling out. He was exposing, they said there, he exposed his own cousin in his magazine for being a PDF file and running off with the 14-year-old babysitter. What the hell? He was not scared to expose his own family for wrongdoing. Now, maybe that's what made him dangerous. Maybe it wasn't the Clintons. Maybe it was people he was exposing in his magazine. But the plane crash that killed him was extremely suspicious. And it happened on July the 16th, 1999, okay? And this was when basically, I'll pull up a video clip about it for you guys. guys here. But this was basically the very tragic, fatal plane crash that ended up taking his life right when he was, looking to get into politics, right when he was running his magazine, exposing people, including his own family, and suddenly it would all come to a very sudden and suspicious close.
The flight was originally scheduled to depart Essex County between 6 and 6:30 p.m., and sunset was at 8:22. Because the flight time was only about an hour and 15 minutes, that meant the original plan had them landing at Martha's Vineyard about 30 to 45 minutes prior to sunset. Unfortunately, John ended up working late, and then he had to go pick up Lauren, and they got to the airport around 8 p.m. Carolyn was also delayed due to traffic and didn't arrive until 20 minutes later, which was right at sunset. That meant instead of flying during the day, they'd be flying during the darkness of the night. And although John was legal to fly VFR at night, this can be very challenging for someone that doesn't have a lot of experience, and you're about to find out why this is so dangerous. But first, there's one more contributing factor that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the weather. John got a weather briefing about 2 hours prior to takeoff, at which time Essex County had clear skies with 4 miles visibility due to haze. Martha's Vineyard also had clear skies with 6 miles visibility due to haze, and Hyannisport had few clouds at 7,000 feet with 6 miles visibility due to haze. Unfortunately, this was based on observations made at 6 p.m., and John didn't take off until 2.5 hours later, and the visibility was gradually getting worse because of the haze. One of the pilots that landed at Essex County just before John took off wanted to warn him that the visibility was worse than forecasted, but he was unable to find him and never got the chance. However, the truth is that even if John had gotten the updated weather just before takeoff, it was still VFR conditions, and that meant he was legal to conduct the flight. That being said, just because something is legal doesn't always mean it's a good idea. You need to understand that night flying is very different from day flying, and it demands a lot more attention of the pilot. The biggest difference is that it's harder to see outside visual references, and you have to rely on your flight instruments a lot more to control the aircraft. To make matters worse, on the night of John's flight, the moon was just a sliver in the sky and provided almost no illumination. This is a very dangerous situation, especially when flying over large bodies of open water, because sometimes those lights on the water can look like stars, and it's very easy to lose sight of the horizon because it can blend in with the water, especially in a very hazy environment. Unfortunately, if John had taken off when he originally planned around 6 p.m., the flight would have been during the daytime, and this tragedy most likely would have been avoided. Instead, John was probably feeling the pressure to make the flight happen, and all the holes in the Swiss cheese were lined up, and he took off around 8:38 p.m. As John took off into the night sky, the controller instructed him to make a right downwind departure. John acknowledged the controller, and that would be the last radio call he would ever make. He departed to the northeast, initially staying below 2,000 feet, before climbing up to 5,500 feet for the cruise portion of the flight. John was probably comfortable for most of the flight, because his cruise altitude most likely kept him above some of the haze, allowing for greater visibility. Now, this could have given him a false sense of confidence that the visibility would be good at a lower altitude, even though he'd be in the middle of the haze. As John headed out over the water, I'm sure he could see the haze below him, obscuring some of the lights, and that's why the safer option would have been to point back towards land, and that way he could fly directly over the coastline until he got a lot closer to Martha's Vineyard. Instead, John continued to head on a direct path towards the island, and when he was about 34 miles from the airport, he began his initial descent. During the descent, John began a right turn to the south, and then about 30 seconds later, he stopped the descent at 2,200 feet and began a climb back up to 2,500 feet, continuing to the southeast away from Martha's Vineyard. Unfortunately, that turn put the shoreline directly behind him and left him staring at a dark and empty ocean. Additionally, because the haze had reduced the visibility to only about 2 miles where he was at, he most likely couldn't see the horizon or any semblance of land to know which way was up or down. About 50 seconds later, John began a left turn and climbed up to 2,600 feet before beginning a descent at a rate of 900 feet per minute. A few seconds later, he reversed the turn back to the right, and the bank increased to over 45 degrees. As he continued to descend, the airspeed increased to over 180 knots, and eventually the descent rate exceeded 4,700 feet per minute as the aircraft spiraled down into the ocean, killing everyone on board instantly. Now that you know how they crashed, we need to talk about why, and the two most shocking parts of this entire story. There has been a lot of debate and speculation about what happened in the final moments of John's flight. Some critics have argued that the aircraft got too slow and it entered a right spin, and John was unable to recover because of that injury to his left ankle, preventing him from being able to apply full left rudder opposite the direction of the spin. However, the NTSB ruled out this scenario because the data they had showed that what happened was a graveyard spiral. This is when a pilot is disoriented and thinks they're flying wings level, when the reality is they're in a descending turn. The pilot will often notice the altitude decreasing as the airspeed increases, and they pull back on the controls to begin a climb and slow down, but because they're in a turn, all this does is tighten the turn, increasing the airspeed and the rate of descent until they hit the ground. Regardless of the reason why John became disoriented, the weather conditions that night made it extremely challenging, if not impossible, for a VFR-only pilot to fly over the water. And
so, clearly, right, it's just, it's just a very unfortunate tragedy. It's the weather. The timing of it is extremely coincidental, but it doesn't seem like he was taken out. It doesn't seem like there were foul play. But what had a lot of people suspicious is there actually was still a lot of unexplained pieces of evidence that were missing. There was a massive delay in the search and rescue efforts immediately following the crash, and a lot of people felt like the way that things were handled after the plane went down wasn't quite right. So there's another documentary called Was JFK Jr. Assassinated that would cover some of the kind of inconsistencies that played out just after the plane actually ended up going down.
As long as possible. And there are more missing pieces. For example, all of John's flight instructors would be shocked to find out that, according to Colonel Rourke and his friends, on this particular flight, John did not follow two of the most basic and routine safety procedures. He did not, according to the bad guys, file a flight plan. And they say he did not contact any of the radar facilities along the route of his flight to Martha's Vineyard. The reason for filing a flight plan with the FAA is that it tells the search and rescue people where to look for you if you go missing. John had always filed a flight plan before on all of his previous trips, but not this time. The missing flight plan is one of the main reasons given by Rourke and his friends for the 15-hour delay locating the crash. There are also several good reasons that a careful and conscientious pilot like John would always contact the air traffic control radar facilities along the route of a flight. First, those who knew John's personal flying habits say that John kept his flight log in an aquamarine duffel on his plane. Witnesses familiar with John, his flight log, and this duffel were watching the news of the crash on CNN and saw this duffel being recovered among the debris from the crash. CNN's website also covered the story of the debris recovered after the crash and quotes a witness who specifically mentions this duffel as among items recovered by the police after it washed up on the beach at Martha's Vineyard. And you'll notice that this bag was described as being intact. So what? Well, according to the witnesses, if the bag was intact, it would have contained John's flight log. Again, so what? Who cares? I mean, why would anyone want to hide the flight log from us? Well, the flight log records who was on the plane, and it does this for one principal reason, so that if the plane crashes, we can recover the flight log and verify who was on the plane. Then we know how many bodies, living or dead, we should be looking for. The insurance companies know whose policy they have to pay out on and whose they don't. To the insurance companies anyway, answering the question of who was on the plane is not a small deal. This question will become even more important in just a minute. Right now, the most important lesson I need you to have learned from the murder of JFK is how to smell a rat. Please recall how we saw that the reports from professional, reliable, on-the-scene witnesses of shots from the front disappeared. They were replaced by unsubstantiated reports that all the shots came from behind. The point is this. When rich and powerful bastards are killing a Democratic leader, our best chance to find out the truth will come from the earliest reports. When we see these early reports from responsible, knowledgeable persons replaced by unsubstantiated reports from people with no name, no experience, the wrong job title, and no credibility, we should resist. We should demand to see credible, substantiated, supporting evidence before accepting the new version that someone is trying to sell us. We need to recognize that this exchanging of bad information for good by itself is evidence that supports a charge of conspiracy to murder. So that means that as John Kennedy's plane was suddenly and catastrophically launched into a headfirst, disastrous plunge towards the sea, John, or his wife, or someone on that plane was overcome by an uncontrollable urge to fiddle with the fuel selector valve. This is absolutely the strangest thing imaginable. It is literally unbelievable. Try it yourself. Get out the yellow pages, look up flight schools, call one up, talk to the guy in charge, and ask him what he thinks of the idea that the fuel selector valve of John Kennedy's plane was found in the off position. He won't believe you. Don't get mad or insulted, but you just better recognize, if we came down this hole looking for something strange, we have found it. We can go home now. Just kidding. We're just getting started. The point is, this is strange. It is obviously strange. You don't have...
So look, a lot of unusual things, right? They're saying that the fuel valve was turned to the off position. That was very unusual. His duffel bag was supposedly going to have a lot of information about the flight in it. And they tried to suggest that, you know, a lot of the information that had initially come out around the flight was then changed later on. But the last thing that people think is one of the most outrageous, you know, mysteries about this situation is there was a 15-hour delay on the actual rescue operation.
The plan was to commit the perfect crime, to grab the body of their Manchurian candidate, pull him out of the wreckage, and whisk him away, leaving no evidence of their crime. No one could ever possibly figure out how they did it. And they left no evidence, except for the 15-hour delay dispatching the search and rescue craft to the crash site. They must have let Georgie, Dick, and Rummy get involved, and as they have with the economy, energy, post-war Iraq, and Hurricane Katrina, they totally screwed it up. They let the plane sink, and then rather than go with Plan B and just let the flight instructor's body get recovered, they created this outrageous delay, without which this investigation would never have begun. The NTAP location was withheld from the Coast Guard and the Civil Air Patrol from 5 a.m. when it was available until the luggage began to wash up on the shore at 1 p.m. in order to give the bad guys time to recover the body of the flight instructor. Do you doubt me? They were out there. They were seen out there. Listen to this.
Okay. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Stanley of the Civil Air Patrol, we appreciate your talking to us. If Kelly Tuthill is still standing by.
Richard Stanley has been out searching the dry land areas of Martha's Vineyard since 7:30 a.m. He's now speaking at 12:15 a.m. Listen closely.
In case the plane in fact had gone down. Go ahead.
Going back to what you said you heard rumors of an NTAP west of...
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. I saw the Coast Guard out there. That's the only thing I had that would hint in that direction.
Okay, yeah. There are reports that there were radar contacts within a few miles west of the vineyard.
Yeah,
so you did see Coast Guard vessels out there searching?
Not vessels, helicopters.
Coast Guard helicopters?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Okay?
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sure, thanks.
Now, wait a minute. Stanley is speaking at 12:15 about events he saw early that morning. Admiral Richard Larrabee of the Coast Guard said several times that the Coast Guard did not get the information necessary to begin a focused search until 1 p.m.
And by about 1 o'clock this afternoon, we had narrowed that focus down to an area of about 17 miles southwest of Martha's Vineyard.
A few minutes after the interview with Richard Stanley, Todd Bergen, the Coast Guard information officer, said the same thing, that he and the Coast Guard didn't have any radar information.
Yes.
And that's the last time the plane was heard from?
That is correct.
At approximately 2,500 feet, 10 miles offshore?
That's my understanding. Like I said, as far as that radar location, I do not have that information.
Officer, is there anything that I failed?
Remember at the Pentagon news conference, at about 1:30, Colonel Rourke insisted that despite the radar information, that they were not focusing on one area.
We'll continue on the same track that we're on, which is to search the entire area.
All these people say there was no information that would lead to a focused search of the waters off Martha's Vineyard, and yet Richard Stanley says...
Correct, yes.
Yeah. I saw the Coast Guard out there. That's the only thing I had that would hint in that direction.
Okay, yeah.
No one was focusing on the crash site, but Stanley says he saw what he took to be the Coast Guard conducting a focused search off the west coast of Martha's Vineyard early in the morning. But that's not possible. In fact, just to be clear, the Coast Guard says it wasn't them. But if it wasn't the Coast Guard, then who was it? Well, we have an answer to that now, don't we? Granted, the evidence in this case is circumstantial. But that doesn't make it crazy to bring George W. up on charges. Crazy? Hell, it's not...
So look, right, they're suggesting George W. Bush is responsible for this. But there's a lot of strange unanswered questions. But one of the craziest parts of this conspiracy, okay, is apparently before he passed away, JFK Jr. sent a pretty outrageous email to Bill Clinton, okay? He apparently teased him at the height of the Lewinsky scandal when all this was going on and he was getting shafted out of the White House. He said, I sat at that desk, or I sat under that desk. There's barely room for a 3-year-old, all right? Apparently, JFK Jr. had sent the president a damning fax about Monica Lewinsky, and it does make you wonder, what was he trying to do with that? And then suddenly he falls out the sky. It is pretty crazy. He'd sent a cheeky note. Somebody said, I was working in the White House when the Monica Lewinsky scandal was going on. A Clinton aide said, I had a fax machine which very few people had the number to. It started kicking in. There's no cover sheet, just a page. It was John. It just said, Dear Mr. President, I sat under that desk. There's barely room for a 3-year-old, much less a 21-year-old intern. Cheers, JK. Typical John. Now, he was basically referring to a famous image of him under the Oval Office desk taken while his father JFK was actually president. But basically, apparently, Clinton actually laughed when he saw Kennedy's note. Apparently, it wasn't bad blood. They said, I showed the president and he laughed his butt off. It was so gutsy and he was the perfect person to bring a little levity. Okay, they were saying it was all a funny little joke. But over on the conspiracy subreddits, they're not taking it as a joke, okay? A lot of people do believe that JFK Jr. was assassinated. They've been posting it. They've been posting the documentary in there. They've been saying, is it true that he was possibly assassinated by people in the political game? It's plausible. There's other conspiracies. The same group of shadow governments, people killed his father. What do you think? Do you think the Clintons had something to do with his death? People are saying, yes, he was about to announce he was running for Senate, the same race Hillary was running in. He would have beaten her, and then in 2008, he would have run for president. Obama would have been his vice president, and he would have served 2 terms. Obama would have won in 2016 and been in his second term. Now, the Clintons killed him. All right, now that actually overlooks the timeline that I told you at the start of this. Okay, a lot of people think it's very interesting. They're saying, of course he would. Of course he was. JFK told his whole family what the government was up to. RFK Jr. knows too much as well, but they threatened him good. That's why his voice is messed up. They dosed him with something to screw up his voice as a warning not to use it against them. That is crazy. Okay, that's actually insane. People saying, I thought so, but I saw a story about the dumb decisions he had made as a new pilot. Okay, as soon as it was confirmed, the CIA-run media started lying about his flying qualifications and experience. That confirmed to me it was a hit, not to mention anyone who goes against Clinton dies suddenly. Okay, people can't really believe it. And more conspiracies will be going around that says JFK Jr., 5 hours after the plane blew up in midair, Bill Clinton ordered the Navy to retrieve the wreckage, destroy the flight logs, cremate the bodies without the consent of the Kennedy family, throw the ashes into the sea, no photographs allowed, all documented in the official investigation report. And they say they did the same thing to bin Laden, right? And then Hillary slid her fat ass into the suddenly safe seat of New York. People saying his plane didn't blow up. right? And they're saying Mohammed Atta's passport magically flew from the cockpit of an exploding airplane he hijacked into the hands of the CIA and FBI on 9/11. Shills have made Reddit unusable, right? Saying this is the actual report of what happened minus the lies. People are basically arguing with that, right? They're saying the black box, this never happens on a standard turn. Pilot error, crashes into water. When the unit was located in the wreckage, it was crushed. Its backup battery was also missing. It had retained no data. Flight recorder black boxes are designed so that doesn't happen. The wreckage should still exist. According to this report, it would be interesting to find out if the insurance company still has it. It says the remainder of the remain parts were released and shipped to the insurance company's storage facilities. Very interesting. Okay, people are saying it's fake news. Some people are saying it's cap. I don't know why anyone keeps pushing this fake news. The plane didn't blow up. The bodies were cremated with the consent of the family after autopsies. There were photos, and I saw them. Pics or it didn't happen. They want to see the pics. Okay, they want to see the pics. What's this one? This is you. So I guess you can look up the full plane wreckage investigation information. People saying it's... People basically giving their opinion on it either way. Now, look, I wanted to learn about this. I wanted to dig into this because this is definitely one of those stories that's kind of like confused me over the years. Look, I don't know if I believe the Clinton body count theory, to be honest with you. It does seem like a few things weren't handled the way that they probably should have been handled, but also sometimes planes crash. Sometimes the weather's bad. Sometimes you can have a really famous last name and be a shoddy pilot and fly in bad weather and end up checking out. But what do you guys think? Do you think it's a conspiracy? You think the Clintons are catching hats out there like little Jeff? Or do you feel like it is just more conspiracy nightmare fuel? Let me know what you thought. I've been a little bit slow making videos today. I've been really tired this weekend. I filmed a bunch of videos yesterday for the main channel and for Influencers Exposed, and yeah, just been exhausted today. So I just did this video. I might do another video today. I might not. I might just get back to it and hot foot a bunch of stories tomorrow. It's been a little bit quiet, nothing crazy going on. So this is just a little throwback story for you guys. But anyway, let me know what you thought of that video. I'll catch you guys in the next one. And for now, I'm out, folks. Peace.